Alright, let's take a look at the Seattle Seahawks and see what did they do in the 2018 offseason, both in free agency and the draft. It was a rough offseason, I think, for the Seattle Seahawks, and certainly for their fans who got to be nervous. First, let's take a look at their cap situation. They were not in a great cap situation, which you'd expect for a team that had so many superstars on their team. You know, they had, on offense, they had Russell Wilson, so that's what, $20+ million per year. You got Michael Bennett on the defensive line. You had Richard Sherman at corner, Earl Thomas, Cam Chancellor, Legend of Boom. You got the middle linebacker. So just a lot, Bobby Wagner, a lot of just superstars on the team. So you wouldn't expect that they would have a ton of cap room, and they didn't. So they started out with $13 million, and as of August, they had about $10.2 million. So they'll have some wiggle room there in case maybe an opportunity presents itself, or maybe a guy, gets lost for the season. They need to replace him. But that's where they're at this point. Now, let's look at some guys that I thought at the beginning of the off-season might get cut. Not guys that I thought would definitely get cut, but guys that were at risk of possibly getting cut. First one was Cliff Avril, because he had a really career-threatening neck injury, and he was in the final year of the contract. He had a great 2016 season, 11.5 sacks, but it is tragic that he had that neck injury. Might not be able to play football ever again, and so Seattle elected to let him go and open up $7 million more in cap space. It's kind of the cold reality of the NFL, is you can get injured, and next thing you know, teams are going to let you go. At cornerback, Jeremy Lane was a guy that I thought was really at risk of getting cut. He had just gotten arrested, I think, for a DUI or something, but he had been benched twice last season. In fact, the Seahawks tried to trade him in the middle of the year, but then he failed his physical, so he had to go back. That's awkward. But by cutting him, Seattle was able to save $3.5 million. Nico Thorpe was another guy that I thought they might let go. He was in the final year of his deal, and the Seahawks could save $1.8 million by letting him go. But so far, it looks like Thorpe will be back around for 2018. Richard Sherman, I put him on this list because I thought it was possible. But I actually didn't think they would really cut Richard Sherman. But they proved me wrong. So, he will be a 30-year-old corner. Not 30-year corner, but 30-year-old corner. And he'll be coming off an Achilles rupture, though. So that's a big deal, right? 30-year-old corner ruptured his Achilles last season, but he's Richard Sherman. If there's anybody who can come back from an Achilles rupture at 30 years old, is Richard Sherman. He is so good at psychologically getting himself to work at extreme levels to prove whoever in his mind doubts him. Are there people that still doubt Richard Sherman? I'm sure there might be. But I'll tell you what, he just zooms in on that and focuses in on that and uses it as motivation, which is brilliant, frankly. Seahawks saved $11 million by letting him go. He signed a 3-year deal worth $27 million with San Francisco, but there's a lot of incentives, playing time incentives, a lot. So if he makes the Pro Bowl, if he plays all the games, his contract is more like $14 million a year. So I like and he negotiated himself. I really like Richard Sherman a lot, actually. He's very, very smart, very cerebral guy. He decided to fire his agent and represent himself. And some people were questioning the deal he signed, but he seemed happy with it. I'm impressed with it. It seems very fair for everybody. He's going to make a decent amount of money this year. There wasn't a lot of guarantees, but if he plays in all the games, he's going to make good money. And if he makes the Pro Bowl, he's going to make really good money. So I would never bet against Richard Sherman. I'll tell you that right now. Among the unrestricted free agents on offense, Paul Richardson, that was probably the biggest name on offense, had 700 yards, blew up in the final year of his rookie contract. Didn't have any really great year before. 288 yards was the best he had before, but 700 yards and 6 touchdowns, that's pretty big. So the Redskins said, hey, look, we see a guy who is on the rise. And so they gave him 5 years and $40 million. So Redskins gave him a big contract. And we'll see how that works out for Washington. But I think Seattle just couldn't. $8 million a year, it would have been tough. Jimmy Graham, that's another big name, maybe even bigger than Paul Richardson. He had 520 yards, so didn't have as many yards as Paul Richardson did, but did have more catches. Also had 10 touchdowns. Was a killer in the red zone last year. But he'll be 31 years old. So, and you can see where his yards really fell off. Okay, from 2011 to 2014, you got a guy that averaged 1,000 yards a season. He didn't get 1,000 every year, but averaged 1,000 yards. And then, 2016, he missed some games with injuries in 2015, so his numbers dropped. But then 2016 played a full season and had 923 yards. Last year had 520 yards. So, how much is he going to contribute next year at 31 years old? That's a big question. But Green Bay paid him 3 years and $30 million. So he didn't even, he was already averaging $10 million a year, and he was able to get it again with Green Bay. So the two guys, I don't see how Seattle could have possibly brought them back. Those are big losses to the Seattle offense, really. So you lose Richard Sherman, you lose Jimmy Graham, you lose Paul Richardson. It's tough. They also lost Luke Wilson, who was playing on a 1-year, $1.8 million contract. Under 200 yards receiving the last 2 years. Those are the 2 years that, 2 years they had Jimmy Graham. But, they had Jimmy Graham in 2015 too. 200 yards. So either way, this is just Luke Wilson isn't a guy who's ever put up really, really huge numbers. He signed a 1-year deal with Detroit for $2.5 million. So we'll see how that works out for Detroit. Eddie Lacy, wow, that was a really bad signing for Seattle. I feel bad for Seattle, actually. Eddie Lacy had been having trouble in Green Bay in terms of the head coach thought he was overweight and wasn't working hard enough. He did have 5.1 yards a carry, but only had 360 yards in 5 games in 2016. Seattle signs him to a 1-year, or signs him to a deal. He got paid $4.25 million. Yeah, 1-year deal was $4.25 million. And he puts up 179 yards and 2.6 yards a carry. That is disgusting. Eddie Lacy played himself right out of the NFL. No one's going to want to touch that. So he did not do well coming off that ankle surgery in 2016. At guard, Luke Jekyll is gone. He did not perform very well last season after returning from an Luke Jokel. I apologize. I don't know why I said Jekyll. Luke Jokel did not play well. He missed 5 games. he was getting paid $7 million, and that's just not good enough at all. He was probably going to lose his job to second-round rookie out of LSU. So, overall, he won't be back. Luke Joeckel, gone. Ode Abushi, also gone. Did not play terrible, but didn't play that good either. He was on a 1-year, $975,000 deal. I think he did get picked up by another team. But he will not be back with Seattle. So you've got some holes there on the offensive line. On the defense, Sheldon Richardson was a free agent, and he signed a 1-year, $8 million deal with the Vikings. He was a solid starter at defensive tackle. He was finishing his 5th-year option. The Jets had gotten rid of him. I guess they just felt like he wasn't in their long-term plans, and you can see Sheldon Richardson's numbers there last year: 44 tackles, 1 sack. So he got a 1-year, $8 million deal with Minnesota. He's a guy to keep an eye on, see how he does. But Seattle just doesn't really have the cap room to bring these guys back. Richard Sherman, gone. Cliff Averill, gone. Sheldon Richardson, gone. Cam Chancellor, done. Jimmy Graham, gone. Paul Richardson, gone. A lot of big names gone. Byron Maxwell, he will be back. Okay? He played very, very poorly in Miami. He played in Seattle in the past, and then he got a deal with Miami and did horrible, so they cut him. He was 30 years old, but played well enough that the Seattle Seahawks decided to give him 1 year and $2 million. So he did pretty well with Seattle after, he did not do well at all with Miami, but played better with Seattle. Michael Wilhoit, linebacker, 31 years old, had 30 tackles last season in 14 games. You can see how his numbers have progressively dropped off from when he was in his 20s. Big season in 2014, 87 tackles, 5 tackles for a loss, 6 passes defended, then 85 in 12 games, 55 in 16 games, and then 30 last season. So he had declining production, became a backup linebacker, was playing on a 1-year, $1.5 million deal. His career might be done. Bradley McDougald was a safety. He played pretty well in replace of Cam Chancellor. He was on a 1-year, $1.8 million deal, and because of Chancellor's injury, the Seahawks decided to bring him back and gave him 3 years and $14 million. He's no Cam Chancellor, but he held his own and played pretty well, so might be a good decision for the Seahawks to bring him back. Deshaun Sheed, primarily a special teams guy, but he received a 1-year, $3.35 million deal with Detroit. So I assume he'll get some defensive snaps over there with Detroit. Let's look at the last couple of defensive free agents. Marcus Smith was a defensive end. Pretty serviceable backup guy, really good depth player, had 14 tackles, 2.5 sacks, forced a couple of fumbles, was on a 1-year, $990,000 deal. He's only 26 years old, and so Seattle decided to give him 1 year and $2.7 million to return. Terrence Garvin was a backup linebacker. He had 24 tackles while playing on a 1-year, $855,000 deal, but Miami decided to bring him over for 1 year and $880,000. So Seattle decided to let him walk. Let's summarize all of the major changes to the Seahawks roster. Well, first of all, they drafted Alex Magoo in the 7th round. We'll see how Mr. Magoo does there in Seattle. I'm not 100% sure that he's going to replace Russell Wilson anytime soon, but at least he'll provide some depth there for Seattle. Hopefully he won't have to play. At running back, Thomas Rawls and Eddie Lacy are gone. You can see Thomas Rawls had a really good season in 2015. 830 yards on 5.6 yards a carry, but the last couple of years, just nowhere near the same production. 349 yards, 3.2 yards a carry, 157 yards, 2.7 yards a carry. So those guys, and then Eddie Lacy is just awful last year. 2.6 yards per carry on 179 yards. Gross. But Rashad Penny will be in, and that is got to be exciting for Seahawks fans. You know, you haven't really had a running back since, Marshawn Lynch left that was just a major player that you knew was going to be able to pick up big yards and, be able to really change the game in a way. A guy you could depend on. But Rashad Penny is probably that guy. First round pick. I do not blame Seattle for wanting to improve their running game. I think it's a good choice. We'll see how it pans out. At wide receiver, Paul Richardson, that's a big loss. Had 700 yards and 6 touchdowns last season. But Seattle just didn't really have the cap space to be able to afford to, compete with what he got from Washington. They did bring in Jaron Brown to replace him. We'll see how that works out. Brown had the best season of his career last year, but that was only 477 yards and 4 touchdowns. So probably going to have some drop-off at wide receiver. They also brought in Brandon Marshall and Marcus Johnson. We'll look at those. Brandon Marshall I think he's a future Hall of Famer. I feel really confident about it, actually. But, in 2015, he had 1,500 yards and 14 touchdowns. In 2016, his numbers almost cut in half, 788 yards and 3 touchdowns. And then last year, he had that, I think he broke his ankle, but only played in 5 games due to injury, had 154 yards. At his age, how much more can Brandon Marshall contribute? If he can bounce back and have even, 600 yards, that'll go a long way to helping Seattle's offense, because they really need some players that can create yardage for Russell Wilson. At tight end, Jimmy Graham, gone. God, you lost Paul Richardson and Jimmy Graham, and you lost Luke Wilson too. You can see his numbers there. It's just so much production. 10 touchdowns for Jimmy Graham. He was a red zone killer. How are you going to replace that? Well, you brought in Ed Dixon. He started in place of Greg Olsen last year in Carolina. You drafted Will Dissly in the 4th round. Kyle Carter, Jerron Ham. I don't know, man. There's Ed Dixon's numbers. 437 yards. But he's old. He's 30 plus, the running game should be better for Seattle, but is the passing game going to be better? I don't see how it could be. At guard, Luke Jokel, as we mentioned, is gone. Ode Abushi gone. Mark Glowinski gone. Who did you bring in? Well, you brought in DJ Fluker, who wasn't very good last season at all. You brought over J.R. Sweezy from Tampa, who wasn't very good either. And then Jamarco Jones, you drafted him in the 5th round. So, I don't know. Russell Wilson's going to be running around again. Man, I feel bad for that guy. I really do. At defensive end, Michael Bennett gone. Cliff Averill gone. Dwight Freeney gone. Although Dwight Freeney had, 3 tackles and 3 sacks. The guy is 100 years old or whatever. But he's a future Hall of Famer, first ballot. But just in terms of what did he really contribute to the Seahawks last year. I mean, it's not a huge loss, but losing Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill, that's a big loss. So how do they try to replace those guys? Well, they draft Rasheem Green in the 3rd round, and they draft Jake Martin in the 6th round. Look, Seattle's going to have a good defensive line. They got a lot of guys, a lot of bodies in there. They have a lot of talent. But if you're strictly comparing this upcoming year's defensive line to last year's defensive line, it's a downgrade. I don't see any other way to look at it. At defensive tackle, Sheldon Richardson gone. I mean, gosh. Garrison Smith gone. How do they try to replace those guys? Well, interestingly, Minnesota and Seattle swapped defensive tackles. Sheldon Richardson went from Seattle to Minnesota, and then so Seattle signed Minnesota's defensive tackles, Tom Johnson and Shamar Stephen. I thought that was interesting. Tom Johnson's not bad. He had 32 tackles last year. I just don't think he has nearly the upside that Sheldon Richardson does. Okay? You look at what is Sheldon Richardson's best sack numbers. Well, 8 and 5. It's pretty good. He had 13 tackles for a loss in 2016. Tom Johnson never had that kind of tackles for a loss, but he had some okay sack numbers in 2014 and 2015. I think it's a downgrade, bottom line. Shamar Stephen, he's not bad either. He was one of the first guys off the bench there, number 3 defensive tackle for Minnesota. He had 28 tackles last season. But just, I don't know. Overall, I'd say not a huge drop-off, given that Sheldon Richardson only had 44 tackles last year and 2 tackles for a loss, but still not an upgrade. At linebacker, Michael Wilhoit gone, Terrence Garvin gone, lost, your number 3, number 4 linebackers, but they're getting a little bit older, especially Michael Wilhoit. How do you replace them? Well, you bring in Barkevious Mingo. He was a 2nd-round guy that had 47 tackles last year, 2 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recovery. I think it's a good pickup. He played well in coverage, too. I like that. I like that signing for Seattle. They also drafted Shaquem Griffin and brought over Joshua Perry, who's a reserve player. I think overall at linebacker, maybe an upgrade. Maybe an upgrade for Seattle. At least holding steady. At corner, Richard Sherman out. Jeremy Lane out. Deshaun Sheed out. Tough, man. I mean, Richard Sherman, when he's healthy, is a Pro Bowl caliber player. It's hard to replace that. How do they try to do it? Well, they brought over Dante Johnson, who was a starter last year, but didn't play particularly great. And they drafted Trey Flowers in the 5th round. I don't know. I don't see any way you can say that Seattle improved at corner. You have to say they took a step back. Even though Richard Sherman, was not playing healthy last year. Had a sore Achilles before it finally ruptured. And finally, at safety, Maurice Alexander is in as a backup guy. What positions did Seattle improve at? They definitely didn't improve at corner. They might have improved a little bit at linebacker. They didn't improve at defensive tackle. They probably didn't take a huge step back, but at the best case scenario, they held steady. Took a step back at defensive end. I mean, listen, I do think Seattle will have a decent defensive line. And in fact, I think Seattle will have a decent defense overall. I'm just saying, when you compare 2017's team to 2018's team, I don't think that Seattle improved on defense this offseason. Now, some of it was because of injuries. They lost Cliff Averill and Cam Chancellor to injuries. But at the same time, Richard Sherman, they cut. I just don't see the defense being better. How could it be? On offense, which one of those? They brought in DJ Fluker and J.R. Sweezy. I don't think their offensive line is going to be significantly better next season. Their wide receivers and tight ends, I don't think they're going to be better next season. So, I don't know. The running back. They improved at running back. That's the one position they probably improved at. I don't see how the Seahawks can make the playoffs this season. They missed the playoffs last year, and I don't think they got better. In fact, I think they got a little bit worse. So it's going to be a rebuilding year, probably in Seattle. I don't think they're going to drop off the face of the earth, and I think their GM has a decent idea of what he's doing. I think maybe in a year or two they could be back, but I don't think it's going to be this year. They need to improve the offensive line. They need more offensive weapons. I don't think they have the offensive power to get it done. But if you did like this video, please click subscribe, because we are going to have some great videos coming up. At the end of the preseason, we're going to break down the final rosters of all 32 teams. And then we are going to have a preview of the upcoming games for each week, for all the games, and we're going to review the previous week's games as well. So you don't want to miss this. Click subscribe, because we are going to have some of the best videos on the NFL on YouTube. Thank you very much.